All right, welcome back to part 2 of a guide to A2 in -1. Again, A2 is our essay writing, and in order to help you out with the A2, the first part of this two-part series looked at what to do in the introduction, what to do in the analysis of source. So I'm not going to go over that part. Today I am now going to focus on not analyzing, but rather responding to the source. So this is a brand new section, deserves its own page, right? So the task of responding to a source begins with the last sentence of your introduction. The last sentence of your introduction should be your intention, your plan, your ideological perspective as it is associated with the issue and the solution that has been presented to you. So your job now is to create a thesis. And the thesis is the most important sentence of the entire paper. It is your promise to the marker of what you intend to argue. And if you include some arguments in your thesis and then you never come back to them, your argumentation is by definition limited, and that is 40%. So the task in the response to the source section of this assignment is firstly, create a thesis. This allows you an opportunity again to respond to the issue that is presented, respond to the solution that is provided, respond to the assumptions that the solution is based on. You should also have a thesis, though, that becomes your argument umbrella, that drives your paper. And the umbrella should be big enough that allows other supporting arguments to assemble underneath it. So we're going to look at some possibilities here so we can give you some examples of what's good and what's better. So possible body one. So possible one way to organize the body is this thesis. Although liberty is desirable, there are times when freedoms cannot be absolute. The danger becomes that in the name of security, freedom might be lost and the state might become dystopian. Therefore, we need a state powerful enough to restrict freedom when necessary, but also a citizenry active enough to shape their relationship with their government. So it sounds brilliant, but it's canned, meaning that this is a thesis statement that I had already prepared before I even looked at the prompt or looked at the source. And what is it missing? What is the issue with this thesis? Well, it's missing those big rocks that were introduced in the discussion. There's no mentioning of the full potential, no mention of division of society. So it is a nicely worded thesis. I mean, I made it. But at the same time that it's nicely worded, is it judiciously applied to the source that's presented? You know, is it an actual response to the source? Not necessarily, right? So we need to be careful that the thesis that we present should be a clear continuation of the conversation started with the source that is provided for us. So the following shows how you now are meant to link evidence to further explore, clarify, and ultimately defend your argument. But it also shows how it is argumentation, not evidence, that should drive the paper. So it's the argumentation that provides focus, and argumentation, therefore, should be your topic sentence of each paragraph. So even if we don't like this thesis, this is how you would create a body based on it. Your A1, your first body paragraph, argument 1, would begin with an argument, a topic sentence that explores liberty is desirable. And underneath that, I have some brainstorming about that. Talk about the evolution of liberty, Hammurabi's Code, Magna Carta, the quest to fill the hearts and minds of the Renaissance thinkers. This sparks the American French revolutions. Yeah, you can read through that. And then the second part of the thesis, there are times when freedom cannot be absolute. So once we have defended this argument, liberty is desirable, check, we've completed that. Now we move on to the next part of our umbrella thesis. There are times when freedoms cannot be absolute. So there's some brainstorming there. You know, some stuff about the Canadian Charter, some stuff about the U.S. Bill of Rights, some specific case studies like the Keekstra case here in Canada, in Alberta in 1984, connection back to Trudeau, some brainstorming, some ideas to build that paragraph. And then the third part of the thesis, the danger becomes that in the name of security, we could lose liberty and drift into controlled dystopias. And there's some contemporary evidence with the Philippines and martial law. There's some contemporary evidence with North Korea, but there's some historical evidence with Stalin. And there's some hypothetical evidence with Big Brother and George Orwell's 1984. So the evidence that we begin to unpack here shows a breadth of evidence. It's not just history, 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 or theory, theory, theory. We have some history, some theory, some hypothetical stuff, some contemporary stuff. Shows that we very comprehensively understand the application of this conversation, this issue that's being presented. The fourth argument that we have, therefore, we need a powerful enough state. Here we can talk about the NSA, we can talk about the USA Patriot Act, we can talk about Anti-Terrorist Act in Canada, we can talk about that accountability and transparency of governance. And then finally, citizens must remain active. And what does that look like? We talk about things like the 13th Amendment, this U.S. Civil rights movement, contemporary things like #MeToo, #Black Lives Matter, and the scandals within government and the need to continue to be able to look into government, right? And be able to see into government and therefore keep the legitimacy and accountability of the will of the people. So that's a body that's well organized, but the issue still remains, the thesis statement didn't really talk about this or that. So if it doesn't talk about division or potential, the full potential of society, to what extent is this essay really a response to the source? You're putting your marker at a difficult position because although it is somewhat connected, it isn't clearly connected. So there's a better way to organize the body. Although all of this evidence is profound, and you can use this evidence in the essay you end up building, I think some of the argumentation needs to be reworded. So let's look at a second possibility. So second possibility, we have a little bit of a shorter thesis. Although, in general, individualism is favorable to collectivism, due to the limitations of mankind, there will remain a need for government. Again, that's very canned, right? That's a thesis that you may be able to use with any source. So, the issue with this thesis, again, the thesis doesn't specifically specify full potential, division of society, the big rocks that we expected you to be addressing in your response to the source. What this thesis does well, though, is it is an umbrella big enough to fit supporting arguments under. And I've got them listed here as A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5. So, although our main argument is, although in general individualism is favorable to collectivism due to limitations of mankind, there will remain a need for government, the thesis, although that's our main argument, there's supporting arguments that can continue and clarify and help defend and help really flush out and explore your main argument. So here I've got those 5 supporting ones. In general, political individualism is better than political collectivism. In general, economic individualism is better than economic collectivism. Economic self-interest is limited, so we need government. Mankind can be dangerous, so we need government. And government must interfere and limit the lives of irrational and violent individuals. So we do have some supporting arguments that continue the logic of your argument, that is the thesis. That's the good thing about this essay. And another good thing about this essay, as you can see, I've organized some evidence underneath it. And the evidence is, again, a variety of contemporary, historical, theoretical, and hypothetical stuff. Evidence is all brilliant. The arguments are good too, but again, I think that we can be more strategic, more precise, right? We're trying for precision. We want you to look at this thesis statement and say, yeah, no, that's a response to the source. Let's see if there's a third possibility we outlined. Look at that, a third possibility. And again, it deserves its own page, doesn't it? So this shows the creation of a thesis that is a better fit, a better response to the source. So we take the source, individualism creates division that destroys society. The path to a nation's full potential is best achieved through collectivism. Now we identified the big rocks. What are the key concepts in that source? Division, destruction, full potential. And And we want to include those things into your thesis. So if your thesis is a response to a source, it makes sense that it should include the big rocks of the source that you're responding to. Think about that. All right, so let's look at this thesis. Now, again, this is more of a sophisticated thesis coming out of Social 30. We're not expecting your thesis in 10 to be quite this long, but we're using this as a teaching tool to show you the steps and the nuances. So although by overcoming division, collectivism can unlock a new potential at a state level, it can also be very dystopian for individuals, and thereby create the seeds of its own destruction. So what we've done in that first sentence is we said, you know what, there's something I do agree with the source about, and that's the although part. But you know what, there's an assumption the source is making that they forgot to take into consideration, and that's the but part. So that first sentence has an although and a but. Although, you're right, by overcoming division, collectivism can unlock a new potential, but this potential is only at the state level, not at the individual level, and lives of the individuals will become quite dystopian, right? So we do an although and a but. And this gives us a chance to fully respond to the source, continue to analyze the source even in the body a little bit, to stay on track, and to show that you understand the nuances, that you understand that social studies isn't about absolutes, that there's many different levels of merit, and we need to consider things here. So next sentence, therefore, in order to achieve the full potential of both the state and individuals within it, we need a state powerful enough to restrict freedom when necessary, but also a citizenry free enough to shape their relationship with their government. So I borrowed some of the language from that first source thesis that we explored here today, and I might still play around with the language, but this was kind of like a first draft here. So now this thesis can be divided into smaller arguments, and each one of these smaller arguments should drive individual sections of the essay, those individual paragraphs of the paper. Your job becomes connecting, supporting arguments and evidence under each of these paragraphs so that you can explore, clarify, and defend your thesis. So at the end of each body paragraph, I should be like, oh, check. This person has developed that argument in a comprehensive way. So the first argument, A1, by overcoming division, collectivism can unlock a new potential at a state level. So that's this part, right? So now I have a part of my essay, a paragraph, that I'm going to say, you know what, you're right, it can do this, right? And we have historical evidence, Stalin's 5-year plans. We have theoretical evidence from Marxism. And no doubt you could come up with more levels of evidence, but I wanted to get this video out there for you guys because the assignment's due soon. And I also want to leave you some room for your own thinking here as well. So by overcoming division, collectivism can unlock a new potential at a state level is an argument that is continuing the logic of our thesis, and here's the evidence attached to the argument. A2, the next argument, the next paragraph. It can also be very dystopian for individuals and thereby create the seeds of its own destruction. Now, if this was a topic sentence, you could put it in, better language here, right? Collectivism will also be very dystopian for individuals, and therefore, so maybe practicing collectivism. So again, there's still going to be the need to go back and edit some of the language here. But I'm borrowing that A2. Where am I grabbing this from? I'm grabbing that directly from this part of the thesis. So I just copied that, right? And I pasted it down here. That's why the language wasn't a complete sentence, because I know that that's the umbrella that my next argument must be. That's the part of the umbrella that my next argument must be. Apparently Google doesn't know how to spell Hitler, or neither do I. So practicing collectivism will also be very dystopian for individuals and thereby create the seeds of its own destruction. Evidence, historical. Life under tyrants is very limiting. Techniques used by Hitler and Stalin to obtain and maintain their rule had negative impact on the citizens. So here we have another argument, right? That really reads as an argument. And then underneath that argument, you'd say evidence, indoctrination, evidence, propaganda, evidence, death camps, evidence, controlled elections, evidence. And you talk about those techniques of dictatorships that really create a dystopian life for the people. So this is kind of a supporting argument more than evidence, but then the evidence would be you listing and describing those techniques used by Hitler and Stalin. And each time that you're talking about them, it's not just like this is what indoctrination is. This is how Hitler used indoctrination, and because of it, the lives of the people became negatively impacted, right? The lives of the people were negatively impacted. We also have evidence. Practicing collectivism will also be very dystopian, and create the seeds of its own destruction is key to this argument. Create the seeds of its own destruction. The fall of the Soviet Union was due to economic and ideological stagnation that resulted from the practice of collectivism. So that might be another supporting argument. So it's an argument because it's a point of view, right? But now, to find evidence for that, I provided you a link here. And the link is an article that talks about those seeds of destruction that existed underneath Stalinistic communism because of the collectivization that they were practicing. But there's other evidence. We could have hypothetical evidence from the Hunger Games or many dystopian pieces of literature. We have theoretical evidence from John Locke that man wants to be free. We have contemporary evidence from the Arab Spring. We have more contemporary evidence that looks at each revolutionary autocracy as it reshuffles this power within family structures, pushes other things like industrialization, will ultimately sow the seeds of its own destruction, as democracy will eventually engulf it. And there's an article on that. We have a related argument that human rights are the product of generations of struggle and shouldn't be compromised without just cause. So when is it just and when is it not just, and what is an important human right is all included in that document. So underneath this umbrella, practicing collectivism will also be very dystopian for individuals and thereby create the seeds of its own destruction. There's a whole breadth of things we can talk about. So we have evidence that would be hypothetical, evidence that would be theoretical, we have contemporary, we have historical, we have related arguments, like the fall of the Soviet Union due to economic and ideological stagnation resulted from the practice of collectivism. So in a very comprehensive way, we've explored that. So then we move on to the next part of the thesis statement. Therefore, in order to achieve the full potential of both the state and individuals within it, now we don't have to define full potential because we did that in the intro, right? Therefore, in order to achieve the full potential of both the state and individuals within it, we need a state powerful enough to restrict freedom when necessary. So we're going to need to explore the when necessary part. So we could do that through theory. Mills-Harm principle can talk about when is it necessary to restrict freedom. We can explore it through a related argument. Due to the nature of mankind, there are elements of the economy that warrant government regulation. So for the students in Social 30, what you should be doing is saying, okay, what have we learned? What was that lesson about? Yesterday, last week, what was the big topic, and how does that big topic fit into this topic? And this is a big topic of one of my lessons in Social 30, and it fits underneath this. It fits underneath, all economic essays. So that's what you need to do, is go back through in an archival inventory kind of way. If it's take home, you can actually go through your notes. If it's in class, then you got to do this in your mind and say, what have we been doing? This is why it's important to review every night. what are we doing, and how does it fit together into one big narrative? Did I mention, what have we been doing? Like, that's an important question to be asking. So not only can you use that argument from class, there's more contemporary evidence too. And I linked the lesson there about which elements of the economy warrant regulation. So you can find it there. You can find it in our online textbook as well. So another argument could be, during times of insecurity, the federal government should be able to control society. And here's a case study of the FLQ. Or if you want to go beyond the FLQ crisis and look, bigger picture, we have this argument. Under some circumstances, in order to ensure the full potential of the state and individuals underneath it, it is reasonable and necessary to limit rights. And then, boom, there's a lesson on human rights. And within that lesson, it explores the language of the Canadian Charter when it talks about the reasonable limits of our fundamental rights in Canada. And it also discusses the Bill of Rights in the United States. So at the beginning of Social 30, I always tell my students, you need to read the textbook before you see me so you can see the big picture. This is our first essay of the year, and I'm bringing up stuff that we haven't covered in class yet, but I'm assuming that you've been exposed to as you have pre-read the course. So if you haven't pre-read the course, you might be sitting there saying, FLQ crisis. I don't really remember that. Maybe we looked at it briefly in 20. Or you might be sitting there and saying, Canadian Charter Rights and Freedoms. Last time I really looked at that was grade 9. So that's why it is important to see the big picture so that you can piece it together here. A4, the next part of the argument, but also a citizenry free enough to shape their relationship with their government, right? So you would take that, because I just cut that from the thesis, you'd make an actual, grammatically correct topic sentence with the language there, and then you'd be like, okay, what's my evidence that we can have a citizenry that is free and active, engaged in that relationship between state and governed? So we have a Prezi that I created on citizens. I have a lesson that I created on citizens. There's 2 chapters in the textbook about citizenship. There's some related arguments about citizenship. Citizens must remain vigilant as they face the attempted illiberal usurpation of their freedom. And there's a lesson on that. There's another related argument. Although the media is meant to be the watchdog democracy, citizens must remain vigilant, as media can often be compromised by the corporate agenda. Here's a lesson on that. Citizens need to be mindful that all mankind is capable of being dishonest, and that this includes members of government, and therefore citizens must never stop holding their elected officials accountable. There's a lesson on that. If only some citizens actively attempt to control the relationship with government, democracy can be compromised, and there's a lesson on the power of lobby groups. A state or society that marginalizes some within compromises the moral integrity of all. And there's a link to a lesson on minority rights of women and the civil rights movement in the United States. So what we see here with all of these related arguments is that in this argument 4 about active citizens trying to shape their relationship with government, there's many directions we can go. And there's many related arguments that we can attach to that bigger argument that's attached back to our thesis. So there's a logical way to build your body. And it begins with a thesis that can be divided into argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. Maybe in this case, we see argument 4. And each of those arguments can be divided even further into, here's a supporting argument, here's another supporting argument. And those supporting arguments have evidence that defend them, evidence that continue them, evidence that clarify them. Because your evidence is only there if it's purposely assigned to your argument. And what is that link between evidence and argument? It's like, oh, this evidence furthers this argument. This evidence clarifies this argument. This evidence defends this argument. It illustrates this argument. You can make a claim. Citizens must remain vigilant as they face the attempted illiberal usurpation of their freedoms. What's the evidence there? So give me an example of an attempted illiberal usurpation of freedom and how citizens say, oh, wait a minute, what you're doing is not right. So I look at that argument and I think of, who's a watchdog of democracy? Who's a whistleblower? Who's someone that said, you know what, the USA Patriot Act and the NSA, they're usurping our Fourth Amendment rights to privacy from government. That related argument makes me want to talk about Edward Snowden. That's an example of evidence, Edward Snowden, and his blowing the whistle of the NSA and the USA Patriot Act violating our Fourth Amendment rights in the United States, that is specifically, purposely, judicially, insightfully attached to argumentation. Argumentation is part of my thesis, and the thesis, a response to the source. It's very mathematical. It's very logical. There's a scientific process here. So I know that humanities can be sometimes kind of alien to people that have more of a mathematical scientific brain, but breaking an essay down into a logical organization should make this a very attainable assignment. This is an assessment that you can excel on if you can see the small steps, and I've just outlined in these 2 videos many small steps. So the only thing stopping you now from getting 30 out of 30 on your essay is filling in those small steps with arguments and evidence. And how do you get arguments and evidence? You pay attention every day in class. How do you get arguments and evidence? You take notes in class. You ask questions in class. You review after class every day. You preview before class every day. So that it's not just a class that's in isolation. You're seeing how it continues from classes before and it links to classes in the future. And stuff we cover in grade 9 is in this essay. Stuff we covered in grade 10 is in this essay. Grade 11 is in this essay. So in grade 12, it's not just a test of grade 12. It's a test of what we've been doing here at WCHS. And if you take a year or 2 or 3 years off from learning and you just kind of float through a course, it's going to catch up with you. Your essay's due.